Continuing with our look at velocity switching and crossfading, let's return to the classical guitar passage and its problem of limited dynamic range. And I'm going to explore what options there are for getting the part to emote in a more musical way. Now, unlike Kontakt, we can't pop the hood on the Play plugin to see how the sound was programmed, but it's easy enough to hear how it was programmed, and in this case we'll see there are only 3 dynamic levels: soft, medium, and loud. And you can hear the sharp divides between the samples. Just like the marimba from the previous tutorial, this sound is programmed so that velocity also influences the overall volume of the samples being played. But the transitions between the samples are pretty sharp, which is a clear indication that we don't have velocity crossfading going on, just velocity switching. So that explains why when I try to play in a crescendo, that sonically, timbrally, emotionally, the sound didn't go anywhere. And that's what happens when you have a single set of samples being triggered by a very wide range of velocity values. Now, the samples themselves are quality samples. They're very well recorded, they sound great, but there's just that something missing. So what can we do? Well, sounds from this library can't be edited, so we don't have the opportunity to go in like in the Kontakt sounds and apply velocity crossfading. One solution, it's maybe the obvious solution, is to look for another sound in one of your other sample libraries that might fit the bill better. And here I've done just that by substituting the sound I was using with the Vienna Instruments Special Edition concert guitar. However, it's very rare that you can simply swap one sound for another and expect that the new sound will respond nicely to your original MIDI performance. What's interesting is that, well, the first crescendo sounds absolutely awful, but the rest of it sounds pretty good. So to try to save this part, I tried lowering the velocities of the harsh notes in this first phrase. But as you can hear, there's no middle ground sample between the soft one and the harsh one. So the net result was either I had harsh notes or I had notes that sounded totally dead. And even though this is just a short little piece, it has to sell a convincing sense of emotion in that first phrase, because it's the emotional drive of the first phrase which sets up the emotional drive of the second phrase, which then sets us up for the emotional peak in the third phrase. So if the piece doesn't start out taking us on a musical journey, if it doesn't set up that little bit of a crescendo and build a feeling of anticipation on which the second phrase can build further, then the piece doesn't reflect my musical intentions and it fails as a mock-up. And that all represents the kind of passion that I try to put into my sample-based mock-ups, but it also reflects the kind of trade-offs that we face when using sampled instruments, where it's not always possible to achieve perfection from any one sampled sound. And being that I know I won't be able to get this sound to work for the first phrase, I think I'm going to go back to the other one and see if I can somehow make that work. Besides, I kind of like the original sound better, but what's interesting is that both of these sounds were designed with only 3 velocity layers. So maybe to play this sort of dynamic part, 3 levels of dynamics just aren't enough to express what I want to express. So perhaps the solution would be to find another sound that has a greater degree of nuance despite the potential problem of getting it to respond well to my original MIDI performance. So for perspective, our guitar sounds have only 3 levels of velocity switching. Meanwhile, the Pt2 sound that I used for that passage, well, I dug into the Kontakt programming and discovered that there are at least 5 different levels of velocity switching. And yes, comparing Pit's violins to guitars is like comparing apples and oranges, but the reason the Pit's passage sounds so much more dynamic is because of the greater number of velocity layers. So generally speaking, the greater the number of velocity layers, whether they're being switched or crossfaded, the better the chance there is for you to write convincing sounding passages that don't fall short of expressing the dynamic qualities that you need to sell your musical intentions. But let's go back to our problem child guitar sound. I don't have a guitar sound that has more than 3 levels of dynamics. So is the only solution here to dip into the piggy bank and buy a new sample library? That would kind of be like the solution, right? Well, here's another option. What's missing from that guitar sound is some excitement during those 2 crescendos. The sound just didn't get bright enough to be commensurate with the increase in dynamics. So, where can I get some brightness from? Well, in the same library that the classical guitar comes from are some very bright steel string guitars. So I loaded up one of those sounds, copied the original part to the new track, and used volume automation to fade the bright guitar sound in and out at the points where I needed the excitement, and in a way simulating velocity crossfading. And here's the result. And even though the sound is no longer purely a classical guitar, here's a case where I think it's more important to sell the idea of the emotion behind the performance than it is for the sound to be 100% accurate. And speaking of accuracy, in the next tutorial on velocity, I'm going to reveal something about your controller which you're probably not going to be too happy about.